Welcome to the Moravian Archives. My name is Paul Poiker, and I'm so glad to see you all here in the reading room. We also have a lot of people online, and welcome to you too online. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Chris Malone. Chris Malone is a curator at Historic Tract, Center for Pennsylvania German Studies. And his research focuses on Pennsylvania German material culture, and especially on the Moravians and other intentional communities. Christopher completed a master's in architecture at Syracuse University and a master's in American material culture from the Winter Tour program. And he's also a graduate of our German script course. Chris has worked for the Moravian Historical Society and also for the Moravian Archives, and as a curator at the American Swedish Historical Museum. He was also a curator of the Lutheran Archive Center at Philadelphia in 2024. He's a columnist for Maine Antique Digest and is the editor of the Daily Antiquarian, a blog focusing on the history, architecture, and material culture of the American Mid-Atlantic. And that's how we first got to know Chris, because the Daily Antiquarian picked up on the posts that the archives put up on Facebook, and we were very honored that someone else was copying and sharing our posts. And then we found out who was behind that. And it's a true honor to have Chris here today to speak on an establishment of order and prosperity, outsider visitation to Moravian Bethlehem. A very timely topic now that Bethlehem and several other Moravian communities have become UNESCO World Heritage Sites. We will see an increase in visitation, but today we're going to learn how all that was handled during the 18th century. Chris.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for everyone at the Moravian Archives. And I'd say this is a sort of second homecoming for this lecture. I did the lecture at the Moravian Historical Society, where I did a lot of research, especially on the material culture aspects. And I spent hours and hours and hours in this very reading room doing research on this topic, going through records. And fortunately for me, I picked a topic that the Moravians tended to write about in English, and so I didn't have to translate too much German, although I did take the script class, so it certainly helped. So my lecture is an establishment of order and prosperity, outsider visitation to Moravian Bethlehem. My research for this thesis was actually prompted by me discovering that I had Moravian ancestry myself, and I discovered that on accident on an online message board from 1999, and it changed everything about my scholarship. And I can tell you the story after the lecture. I want to dedicate this thesis to the memory of the Kassler family. So that's my ancestry, who lived, worked, and worshipped as Moravians in Philadelphia, Lidditz, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. To Johann Ludwig and Anna Christina and all of their descendants who gave me a sense of place and history in Pennsylvania. And finally, to my distant Moravian cousin, Marilyn Garrison and Gail O'Brien, who I contacted on that message board randomly for their gift of lineage and tireless research of 15 years before I discovered them. And I wanted to let you know there is so much more from this thesis that you'll hear in this talk, especially for such a captivating audience. So I would like you to know that you can access this thesis if you'd like to read it on the University of Delaware's master's thesis page. And if you can't find it, we beheld it with agreeable surprise at some distance upon the summit and closed form of church-controlled communalism to an entirely open society. This change was precipitated by the outside world's direct influence on the Moravians' mission efforts towards the Native Americans. Bethlehem went from an economy based on supporting their missionary goals to one that focused on pleasing outsiders through the goods and services that they provided to those visitors. I argue that this mission change created an additional, yet unofficial congregational choir, that I like to call the strangers choir, as opposed to the sisters choir or the brothers choir, whom the Moravians administered to by refocusing their economic, social, and spiritual connections on those outsiders. It cannot be stressed enough how religion and spirituality played a deeply active role in all aspects of Moravian life, especially material culture. While these ideas might seem unfathomable or superstitious to many today, they profoundly guided every decision, labor, trade, economic exchange, dress, social hierarchy, and even the very design and layout of the village. The very act of making furniture or spinning wool was guided by the idea that everything they did was for the glory of God. The nature of life within a Moravian town, like other communal groups, was often seen as peculiar to outsiders, but was one of the biggest driving forces behind those visitations. The church and its members were seen as a spectacle or curiosity, an anomaly amongst their English and German-speaking neighbors. Outsiders flocked to Bethlehem for their health, to be entertained, and for the church's international trade connections. By adapting their community structure with the changing tastes of American life, the Moravians actively practiced self-preservation by consistently redeveloping their own material culture to that of the world's. For the Moravians, much of their way of life was dictated by the presence of outsiders within their communal spaces, which ultimately affected the material makeup of the things we often determine as purely Moravian. The Moravians at Bethlehem always had to contend with those who were not members of the church, including their own neighbors and other people they referred to as Fremden or strangers. As a truly international sectarian group, the Moravians relied on their vast connections in a number of outposts throughout the world, including their base in Herrnhut, a town in what is now present-day Germany. The cosmopolitanism of the Zinzendorf family helped the Moravians in North America engage with an outside world that continually benefited them economically, politically, and socially. The Moravians' willingness to adapt to strangers helped them to successfully engage with outsiders on an experiential and material level. But why did people come? They came because they were curious. They visited as an early form of tourism, focusing on leisure. They came for their health, and finally, for the goods that the Moravians offered. We can better understand how Moravian material culture affected the time outsiders spent in Bethlehem. For instance, most visitors were delighted by the samplers or the hairwork art produced by the Ladies' Seminary, whereas other visitors were appalled by the books kept in their libraries, especially those related to early Moravian blood and wounds theology. Visitors described the intriguing architecture, the curious Moravian dress, the foods they ate, the cloth they bought, the paintings they were shown, and the instruments that they heard, and the gardens and landscapes that they enjoyed. While the Moravians recorded much of their own material culture in their daybooks and diaries, visitor accounts give an outside perspective on what Moravians saw every day. These accounts are a window into what aspects of Moravian material culture visitors were most fascinated by, and what relics of their culture are still actively consumed by outsiders even today. Beginning in the 18th century, inns all along the eastern seaboard started to host outsiders looking for rest and relaxation away from their urban lifestyle. Visitors came to Bethlehem seeking pleasure as well as business ties. The gardens, the industries, and fresh country air brought people of all walks of life to the business town, while disease and a lack of space forced others to flee cities like New York and Philadelphia for the oasis the Moravians created in the Pennsylvania hinterland. Two visitors in particular had very different experiences while visiting Bethlehem. John Cozens Ogden was a presbyter in the Presbyterian Episcopal Church and visited Bethlehem in 1799. Ogden's account is almost entirely positive, and he comes away with a favorable impression of the Moravian brethren. In most visitor accounts, positive experiences appear to be the norm. When a person felt financially cheated, however, by the community, or they were not chosen to live among the brethren as they attempted to do so, it then became negative. By all accounts, Ogden received the gold standard Moravian visit. However, Israel Acrelius, a Swedish Lutheran minister, visited Bethlehem around 1756 and published his travel account in Sweden in 1759 entitled A History of New Sweden, or the Settlements on the Delaware River. Aurelius's account greatly differs. Israel Aurelius, along with the Reverend Peter Brunholtz, Pastor Eric Unander, and Henry Slidorn, all German or Swedish Lutherans, visited Bethlehem as a part of their tour of New Sweden, which is a reference to the 17th century Swedish colony near Philadelphia. Many of the towns and cities along the Delaware River in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Delaware were considered New Sweden. Upon arrival over the Philadelphia Road, so around where 378 is today, they first stopped at the Crown Inn, where they asked to see Moravian Bishop August Gottlieb Spangenberg. Unfortunately, Spangenberg had traveled to Nazareth, the Moravians' agricultural town 10 miles north of Bethlehem. While not explicitly stated, Christian Thomas Benzian acted as what the Moravians called the Fremdendiener, or the stranger helper, for these Lutheran visitors. The Fremdendiener's job was to help strangers get what they needed from the Moravians. This could include directions to the store, a tour through the village, or an introduction to a church elder. Throughout each Moravian town, a Fremdendiener was chosen to guide and monitor strangers whenever they visited. Other Fremdendieners included John Christian Vineland in Nazareth, Wilhelm Linnaeus of Lidditz, and Maria Mary Penry, also of Lidditz. Many were chosen for their language abilities, which is perhaps why Christian Benzian took on the role when Aurelius and his group visited. Aurelius spoke Swedish, and Benzian is known to have come from Livonia, present-day Estonia and Latvia. During Ogden's visit in 1799, Brother Francis Thomas was the Fremdendiener. He served in this position so long that he became affectionately known as Daddy Thomas to Moravians and outsiders alike. The Fremdendiener was paid for their services and was often performed by individuals who were in the retirement years. It is unclear whether these services were paid during the general economy, but they show up in records after 1762. The Fremdendiener was the mouthpiece for the church leaders and helped the town control the elders' chosen narrative to outsiders. It is interesting to compare the way that John Ogden was greeted and escorted through Bethlehem with the way Israel Aurelius and his cohort were treated by Christian Benzian. Both visitors were greeted with enthusiasm. But Aurelius's tour soon turned tense because his party could not hold back their religiously motivated judgments about Bethlehem and its inhabitants. In the first few paragraphs of his account, Aurelius describes Bethlehem as nothing very much to admire beyond what I have noticed in passing. Aurelius' account brings to light another material-based contention between the church and outsiders. Moravian tradition and theology manifested itself in the early years of the town in various ways. One of the most glaring and sometimes offensive material manifestations was an inscription over the single brother's house that read, Vater und Mutter und lieber Mann habt vom Jünglingsplan, which meant, Father and mother and dear husband, be honored by the young man's plan. Our friend here, Moravian scholar Paul Poiker, suggests that this was offensive to non-Moravians because it insinuated that either the Holy Spirit was a mother or that Christ was a husband to the single men who dwelled within this massive communal living structure. Perhaps even more provocative was a sundial located on the other side of the building with the inscription Gloriae Plurii, or glory be to the side wound. This fuller color pen and ink drawing held within the Universitätsarchiv in Herrnhut, Germany, shows the single brethren's house with what appears to be a mural depicting the side hole or wound of Christ. Some of the early German Reformed and Quaker congregations living around the Moravians were traditionally against religious ornamentation, especially of Christ and the saints. The derision of outsiders eventually caused the Moravians to remove the inscription, one of the many material changes due to strangers that they made in their first 100 years. Today, the inscription and the sundial have been restored to the facade of the single brother's house, though for most people, for most visitors today, their meaning has been lost to time. Bethlehem was like a Russian Matryoshka doll. The most public spaces were located outside of this elusive boundary surrounding the town. The town was carefully guarded by watchmen at night in watchtowers specifically built to provide community surveillance. The farther you traveled into Bethlehem, the closer you got to Moravian's spiritual center. The periphery consisted of farmland, the inns and the stranger's store. Next, the buildings used for trades lined the Monocacy Creek and the Lehigh River. At the center were the choir houses and the Gemein House, or the community house. Within these two structures was the community's chapel, essentially hidden from the outside world by stone. By the time that John Ogden visited Bethlehem in 1799, the Moravians had constructed a bridge over the Lehigh River, which was the only way to cross into Bethlehem from the south. During his visit, Ogden found the bridge to be undergoing repair and therefore had to use the Moravian-controlled ferry service, which he described as safe and easy. Likewise, during Acrelius's visit, he and his companions had to use the ferry to access the town by crossing the Lehigh River on Bethlehem's southern border. Ferry service was charged to visitor accounts at the town's first hostelry, the Crown Inn. In 1765, Joseph Fox Esquire was charged 3 shillings and 2 pence to be ferried across the river. His bill was recorded in the Crown Inn's daybook by innkeeper John Gottfried Graves. Like the tavern, the ferry was administered by specifically chosen successive people. The ferryman and his wife lived in a log cabin near the inn's stables. At the beginning of the ferry service, the Moravians were not yet granted total control over who crossed this portion of the river. But by 1756, they were given sole privileges of ferrying travelers across, 1 mile above and 1 mile below Bethlehem's boundaries. That same year, a new flat ferry boat was built that measured 40 feet in length, more than 10 feet larger than their previous ferry. In a letter written to John Gardner in 1787, Nicholas Garrison Jr., a Moravian ship captain and surveyor, revealed that the flat ferry was almost 50 feet long and had the ability to transport carriages, horses, and people over the river with ease, which is what you're seeing here in this image. The drawing here, done by Garrison for James Bodwin, shows that the ferry attached to a rope strung across the river. The ferry had curved sides and bridges, which Garrison refers to in his letter as the means by which the carriages entered and exited the ferry. If his drawings are accurate, the ferry could fit a carriage, 4 horses, and at least 3 passengers. By the mid-1750s, a stagecoach line from Philadelphia had made Bethlehem a major stop along the route to New York. In this advertisement from 1820, the Great Northern Stage Line provided services for passengers from Mr. George Yoha's Hotel, sign of the General Washington, number 6 North 4th Street in Philadelphia, and it arrives in Bethlehem at 5 p.m. Passengers paid a reduced fare of only $3 to Bethlehem by traveling on the Bethlehem and Philadelphia stage proprietors. Bethlehem was important enough to warrant its own stagecoach line from the largest city in the United States at the time. Many Moravian merchants lived independent lives in Philadelphia and were utilized by Bethlehem's tavern and storekeepers for goods and supplies. The Moravians had a church community in Philadelphia made up of tradespeople who did not live within or directly contribute to Bethlehem's communal system. However, they did provide excellent trade connections, political ties to city leaders, and contact with the Quaker-run Pennsylvania Assembly. When visitors reached Moravian towns, they would have immediately noticed that Moravian women wore peculiar clothing that stood out when compared to other women's dress of the time. Moravian sisters' appearance was highlighted by 2 particular textiles, a colored silk or muslin ribbon and a linen head cap called a schneppelhaube, which roughly translates to beaked hood. Use of the haube dates back to the 1720s when women living in Zinzendorf's estate began wearing this distinctive cap as a way to differentiate themselves from non-Moravians. While attending a Moravian religious service, John Ogden was fixated on what the sisters were wearing. He describes the whole congregation of women as appearing in plain habits who wore white garments with white caps and under the chin a ribbon. Israel Acrelius describes a similar scene at an evening service. Women wore white caps which were tied under the chin with a rosette of ribbon. Throughout the years, and depending on what Moravian conclave people lived within, other colors like green were introduced, but pink, blue, white, and red were almost universally seen by outsiders. For some visitors, the nun-like dress of Moravian women was exactly how they imagined a cloistered or communal people to look. Men, however, dressed in mostly plain or simple cloth as advised by the governing body of the church. They were indistinguishable from their neighbors. Like Quakers, Moravians were discouraged from dressing conspicuously. In some cases, church leaders had to warn members that their clothing choices were unbefitting of their pious faith. When Eliza Southgate Bound visited Bethlehem in 1803, Moravian women were already becoming disillusioned with the old-fashioned way the Haube portrayed them to outsiders. By 1815, the women of Nazareth actively retired their Hauben in a controversial act now known as the Haube Revolt. According to one visitor in 1826, the Haube was barely being worn by members of the congregation, except older women who decided to hold on to this traditional cap. Many of the women who participated in the revolt had contact with non-Moravian women who visited Bethlehem, those who attended the ladies' seminary or purchased goods at the stranger's store, which actually sold some of the latest styles. The material culture and tastes of outsiders clearly impacted the way Moravian women saw themselves and eventually led them to discard one of the most visual expressions of Moravian material culture. In most cases, Moravian inns were built just outside of the community because non-Moravians were prohibited from staying within the town unless they were visiting for commercial reasons or had a business with church elders. Complaints were levied against church members by other members for violating this rule. In the Moravian town of Salem, North Carolina, the tavern was one of the first buildings to be built. In 1755, a wooden tavern was placed at the south end of that town, now the site of the present-day brick structure, which was completed in 1785. The Moravian Church ran a network of taverns throughout their Pennsylvania settlements, including the Gasthaus zur Rose, or the Rose Inn or Tavern in Nazareth, and the Zum Anker in Lidditz, Lancaster County. The Sun Inn, Bethlehem's imposing tavern, was a grandiose structure made of river and fieldstone. The inn had a red clay tiled Dutch gambrel roof, which can be found among the architecture of the Silesian region where the Moravians settled in Germany. Various homes dotting the Pennsylvania countryside built by the Moravian Germans' neighbors also had red tile roofs. The Sun Inn was 2 full stories with additional accommodations on a 3rd floor under the eaves. John Ogden describes the Sun Inn as having 4 large rooms on all 3 floors, which were subdivided on the 2nd and 3rd floors into the 2 bedrooms and 1 large private dining room per suite. In a letter to his wife, Abigail, John Adams, 2nd President of the United States, recalled his stay at the Sun Inn. When we came into the town, we were directed to a public house kept by a Mr. Johnson, which I think was the best inn I ever saw. It belongs, it seems, to the society, is furnished at their expense, and is kept for their profit or at their loss. Here you might find every accommodation that you could wish for yourself, your servants, and horses at no extravagant rates. The Sun Inn was certainly a commodious public house. The front facade had 6 windows on the 1st floor and 7 windows on the 2nd floor. The 3rd story within the roof was lit by 4 dormers. The inn had between 18 and 20 rooms among the 3 floors, which could be rented out as whole apartments or smaller spaces. Guests were given the choice to dine on the 1st or 2nd floor, where 2 dining rooms served the inn's visitors. Visitors to the inn had a plethora of drinks to choose from, including wine from Madeira, Lisbon, and Tenerife, as well as red port and currant wine. They drank Jamaican spirits, Philadelphia rum, Genever, the French brandy, cordials, 2 kinds of cider, a multitude of beers, and both coffee and tea. Much of the inn's alcohol was kept in the basement, which had a brick or stone vaulted ceilings similar to Germanic breweries. Guests also had access to chocolate, sugar, butter, lemons, dried meats, and gammons, which are smoked ham or bacon. I'm going to read you a little passage. When my ancestor, Abraham Levering, who married into the Castler family, was the tavern keeper. So when Abraham Levering was the tavern keeper in Bethlehem between 1790 and 1800, he received countless letters from former guests complimenting his wife, Anna Christina Levering, née Castler. Several letters from a James Bingham refer to Anna Christina as quote unquote, "Your fat wife, but a good-natured woman she is." Which suggests that the Leverings were friends with some of their customers who felt comfortable enough to make jokes about Abraham Levering's presumably pregnant wife. In another letter, Bingham states that Mrs. Levering orders good belly timbers for gentlemen, which refers to the food she served at the tavern, and ends with, "Any gentleman who says he is not pleased deserves the gallows." In fact, James Bingham, who owned an estate nearby, even invited Abraham and Anna Christina to his home for dinner. This hints that the Moravian innkeepers mediated between their roles as pious church members and community liaisons. Between those who ran Moravian taverns and those who acted as the Fremdendieners, church authorities had numerous representatives keeping a watchful eye on those who had access to the town that they controlled. Gradually, the inns became a hub for the exchange of material goods and conversation. All areas of Bethlehem's public sphere facilitated meetings between Moravians and strangers who brought their tastes and desires to the community. One of the most fascinating aspects of Bethlehem's first inn, the Crown, was also that it sold books. In 1745, the church established a boekladen, or bookstore, which was run by the proprietor, Samuel Powell. Choosing the inn across the river made sense because it was on the route from Philadelphia, where they purchased their stock of books. The Crown Inn was also one of the only public-facing structures established in Bethlehem by 1745. Both the Sun Inn and the Stranger's Store were not yet built. Having a bookstore within the Crown Inn signified the Moravians' desire to offer books, both religious and secular, to outsiders rather than just purchasing books for their own congregation. The establishment of the Sun and Crown Inns in Bethlehem offered the Moravians a physical space that mediated how they wanted to represent themselves to the public in a way that was meticulously controlled by the elders and those they chose to run these institutions. Their desire to please visitors with choice wines, imported foods, and their unparalleled accommodations ensured Bethlehem would be a destination for non-Moravians going forward. Bethlehem provided outsiders with many of the things they needed to comfortably survive, but it also attracted strangers who wanted to experience the Moravians' formal gardens and cultivated landscapes that they saw in drawings and engravings distributed in America and abroad. Bethlehem was often depicted by artists as a biblical city on a hill, and its formal gardens, abundance of fish, handsome buildings, and industrious people provided a playground for leisure seekers who were curious about Bethlehem and who wished to experience for themselves this Eden in the wilderness. John Ogden, when he came in 1799, was taken to the rooftop balustrade on top of the Brethren's house in Bethlehem, which overlooked the gardens surrounding the town. So this is the brother's house there, and you can't really see the balustrade, but the gardens are here down by the river. He was astonished by the verdant mountains, which rose above the confluence of the Lehigh and the Monocacy Creek. He remarked on the variety of walks and rows of trees, which he believed showed the Moravians in possession of great taste and economy. Ogden called what the Moravians had pleasure gardens. For the Moravians, gardens seemed to be connected with the planned geometric gardens of the European aristocracy, used mainly for walks and perhaps spiritual reflection. During his stay, Ogden made the journey up to Nazareth to see some of the upper places. Aside from Bethlehem, the Moravians operated several smaller towns and villages that contributed to their general economy. These included Nazareth, Christiansbrunn, Gnadental, Friedenstal, and the Rose Tavern. A manor house in Nazareth, said to be one of the largest private homes in America in the 1750s, was originally built for the Zinzendorf family, but was converted into a school called Nazareth Hall because Zinzendorf died before its completion. Nazareth Hall first educated Moravian boys to become ministers, but later opened to outsiders throughout America. The school famously planted what were called the pleasure gardens. Ogden noted that many of the tutors at the school were familiar with the public gardens and country houses of Europe. The students used the gardens for recreation and for learning such things as gardening, farming, botany, and tree sciences. The garden included trees from all over, as well as exotic plants, which covered a nearby sloping hill complete with circular walks, falling gardens, steps upon the hill, banks of flowers, a summer house, places to sit, herbs, fruit plants, and vegetables. The Moravians' understanding of the neatness and geometric qualities of European gardens also informed the design of their cemeteries. Visitors frequently commented on the straight lines of their cemetery sidewalks and the diminutive 9x14 stones that sat atop small mounds demarcating the graves. Moravian cemeteries, called Gottes Acker or God's Acre, are a microcosm of Moravian spirituality, community life, and the physical and material towns in which they lived. Moravians were buried within their choir and separated by sex, even in death. Moravians of all nations, ethnicities, and races were buried together regardless of their occupation in life. The Gottes Acker in Bethlehem was surrounded on one side by an impenetrable stone wall, which protected the edges of the community by facing towards the outside world, while the remaining sides were surrounded by wooden fences, which could be expanded as the cemetery grew. Interestingly, outsiders who passed away while visiting Bethlehem were afforded a space within the burial ground, but were buried as close to the stone wall as possible, outside the rows of individual choirs. The cemetery was shaded by trees, it provided pathways for walks, and marked events in the Moravian liturgical year, such as Easter. By visiting the cemetery, visitors experienced Moravian Bethlehem, but on a much smaller and more solemn scale. The outside world was kept at bay by one wall, but outsiders were encouraged to visit through the others. Bethlehem also had a share of visitors who came to seek pleasure and worldly goods. The town outright attracted visitors by offering these experiences, and it seemed impressive to outsiders because its design was rooted in German utopian town planning and Zinzendorf's cosmopolitan and courtly connections. Bethlehem's landscape and gardens were made possible by a network of springs, creeks, rivers, and a series of underground pipes that the Moravians used to provide water for the community and the inns. Today, the Monocacy Creek gently meanders through Northampton County's rolling countryside, along small towns and villages before it flows past Bethlehem's former industrial area and into the Lehigh River. The river was an important waterway for the Moravians and their visitors because it acted as a physical barrier for the community, but also a source of enjoyment for visiting strangers. The river would eventually be opened by the Moravians who built bridges, both physically and metaphorically, that provided unimpeded access to the village on the hill. The Lehigh River had several islands which the Moravians used as rest spots and occasionally for bathing. The island was covered with enough trees to provide modesty for bathers who, according to Ogden when he visited, wore suitable bathing clothes and were assisted by attendants. In the 18th century, bathing gowns for women were constructed like the shifts that they wore underneath their clothes, but with alterations. A linen bathing gown, as seen here in the Mount Vernon collection, includes lead weights sewn into the hem so the fabric did not bunch up on the bather when in the river. Calypso Island on the Lehigh was large enough for shelters similar to gazebos, which visitors and church members sat under and took tea on a pleasant day. If walking or robust conversation was not a visitor's forte, the islands were good for fishing. The river is home to an array of fish, including trout and bass. When Israel Acrelius sat down to dinner one warm evening, he was served trout, which was an admitted rarity for him. Trout was evidently abundant in the Lehigh River because the Moravians made cages which held the fish so they could be easily procured for meals. This proved to be a temptation for many outsiders. At one of their meetings, the town elders noted that they needed to remain watchful over their cages because occasionally people wandered over and took the fish that they had caught. It is unclear if the Moravians provided fishing poles for visitors or if the poles were something strangers brought themselves, but the store did carry fish hooks among its inventory. The Moravians were able to transform the waterways they relied on into modes of enjoyment for those looking for some leisure time. The Bethlehem landscape gradually became a playground for the Moravians, their neighbors, and those who were fortunate enough to spend time in the town. But the Monocacy Creek and the Lehigh River were tools of industry and control for the community, but became a means for outsiders to relieve stress, provide entertainment, and a source for food to serve guests. Outsiders who walked along the river enjoyed the sounds of birds singing, water trickling over the rocks, and grist mill wheels turning slowly along the creek. The pleasurable sights and sounds gave outsiders a reason to permeate that communal boundary, which the Moravians actively eroded themselves over the first 100 years of their existence. Visitors to Bethlehem and almost any Moravian town would have experienced music being played in their communal houses, in the schools by the students during religious ceremonies, from the church steeple announcing church member deaths, and during concerts held for both the community and strangers. John Ogden was amazed to find that almost every room he entered was filled with some sort of musical instrument. Each service he attended was complemented by music played on the organ located in the Gemeinhaus Saal. When Acrelius and his company first walked up to and entered the Saal, they were greeted by organ music. Hearing the music outside was not enough for the men because they implored to allow them to hear more. Can you imagine? They implored them to hear more, even though they were critical of them the whole time. Suddenly, trumpets filled the air and called them to explore the town further. The company followed those brassy notes along the creek and lingered for a while, enjoying the soundscape. Music seemed to act not only as a pleasure device to outsiders, but the sounds coming from these instruments acted as wayfinders across the community landscape, beckoning people to explore further because the noises were often unfamiliar to those visiting. The Moravians took great pride in their music. They readily offered to play for visitors and made sure those who attended services sat closest to where the music was best heard. Acrelius observed that, though the service he attended included both the violin and the flute, the Moravians sat at the back, so none of them were seen. Perhaps the Moravians wished that their music, at least in religious settings, became an unseen spiritual part of their worship that elevated the ceremony above the objects, people, and even the materials of the rooms towards the heavens that they called upon. This multi-sensory experience became an intoxicating draw for outsiders whose sense of curiosity and religious voyeurism needed to be satiated by visiting communities unlike their own. Music was entangled with almost every aspect of Moravian life. Acrelius notes that music was so important that their musicians were given the job to cultivate the community silkworms because the task was so slow that they were able to pick up their instruments and play at a moment's notice, leaving the worms to their leaves. Aside from religious services, the Moravians celebrated community and choir-specific festivals almost weekly. Love feasts were held for all strata of Moravian society, from the whole community down to individual trades or choirs. Coffee, tea, or lemonade are traditional drinks served in what has become known as love feast mugs. These mugs were different in almost each community and varied in size and shape. Some mugs could hold a substantial amount of liquid, while others reflected present-day espresso cups. The Moravians had their own potters, so the mugs were provided by the tradespeople for the church. The love feast acted as a community gatherer for the Moravians, which could also potentially introduce outsiders to their religion. Bethlehem Saal was erected in 1751 when the Saal and the Gemeinhaus became too small. In the chapel, the communion table sat slightly elevated on the western wall and was covered with a black cloth. On the north end of the western wall sat the wives of the ministers, and on the southern end, the ministers themselves. The rest of the room was divided by choir, men on one side and women on the other. There were raised galleries at the northern and southern ends of the Saal. The organ was located at the southern end where the musicians and singers sat. Architectural historian William Murtaugh describes the benches in the Saal as customarily German backless benches, which included some Baroque features like S-curved legs, though later iterations included an angled seat rail, as seen in the image. These benches were universal within the church and could be found from Herrnhut to Antigua. In his book, We Sit Together, Francis Cape reflects on the bench as a general sharing of values, but also that the design and use of a bench in a communal setting reflects, to some degree at least, the structures and values of that particular community. Like their co-communalists at the German pietist Ephrata Cloister, or with the Shakers, the Moravians believed that everyone's soul was equal before the eyes of God, and therefore the benches within the Saal partially reflected this ideology. The Saal, like the Gottesacker, is a spatial and material manifestation of the Moravian faith, where men, women, boys, and girls, and outsiders were all grouped next to their respective spiritual equals. Unlike the burial ground, the chapel did make distinctions between regular members and church elders, their wives, and the musicians. For outsiders, their placement together meant that they were not part of the church body and signified their status as physical outsiders from the rest of the congregation. Though many strangers came to experience Moravian religious services as an interesting spectacle, they became a spectacle to the members inside the community by their very presence. The church, however, tried to appease their guests just as they did in the inns and the store. They placed strangers nearest to the organ and musicians so they could more easily hear the music, or on the wall next to the ministers. Outsiders often sat on brettstühlen placed within the zaal. These chairs were also universally used within Moravian towns in multiple locations and were useful because they could be moved around and brought inside the chapel depending on how many visitors were attending a service. This chair from the Moravian Sisters' house in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, is actually marked on the bottom from that specific sister's house. Many Moravian chairs, if they're not coming from Moravian collections, are sort of normally just peasant chairs. So it's actually hard to actually relate them to a community, but this one has a specific provenance. These chairs are known as brettstuhl or plank bottom chairs. Its legs were shaped by a plane or a knife rather than turned on a lathe, so they were easy to make. On the underside of the seat, there are two battens that slide into dovetails, and this gives the seat its strength and provides it from warping. The dovetails were made with a tool called a grotten oval, a side cutting plane used almost exclusively by Germanic craftsmen of the time, which is why these chairs are often called Moravian chairs today by collectors. Church authorities were careful when choosing their own shopkeepers as well. Proprietors of any public-facing body of the church had to have experience with worldly affairs and the ability to liaise with outsiders while adhering to Moravian beliefs and virtues. The backgrounds of each of the shopkeepers were grounded in trades or a familiarity with the ways of strangers. These shopkeepers would directly influence the taste and objects that the Moravians saw in the store based on the needs and wants of outsiders. In a way, the shopkeepers became the arbiters of taste for their communities who eventually succumbed to some of the worldly goods offered through the stranger's store. Each shopkeeper the Moravians installed in the stranger's store had numerous things in common. They all had merchant backgrounds or apprenticed as shopkeepers before taking charge. Each of them hailed from predominantly English-speaking countries or cities, and many were born outside the Moravian communal system. They each had wives who could assist with tasks like greeting customers or helping female shoppers with their purchases. The church saw married women as spiritual buffers to the outside world, who ensured their husbands did not give in to the temptations they may have come with constant interaction with strangers. Finally, the shopkeepers' backgrounds made them more likely to understand English and later American laws, as well as the language and accounting practices of their neighbors. All of these qualities combined to make a person who was readily and economically to represent the church to the outside world. The Moravians' willingness to strategically develop their economic interests allowed the stranger's store and Bethlehem's networks of goods to grow and evolve over time. After the general economy ended and the store remained under church authority, subsequent shopkeepers diversified the store's inventory, which attracted more outsiders to frequent the community. Domestic and international goods were chosen based on what those strangers liked and would be likely to purchase. The material needs and wants of strangers pushed the Moravians further and further into the world. When the Moravians founded Bethlehem, they intended everything about the town to center on glorifying God. The landscape, the architecture, the goods sold in the stores, and the goods made in town all represented their spiritual piety. Like other pietist sects and communal societies, the Moravians believed even their labor was an act of worship. When travelers turned the corner on the Philadelphia Road, they saw the imposing stone structures above the Lehigh River. Bethlehem truly was an establishment of order and prosperity, a sight to behold in the Pennsylvania wilderness. By the turn of the century, Bethlehem looked vastly different than it did in the 1740s. After the events of the 7 Years' War, the sights and sounds of Bethlehem's native population dwindled to almost nothing. The indigenous populations of Pennsylvania were mostly driven to Ohio and then to Kentucky and Oklahoma as westward expansion increased during the nation's new republic period. The general economy had been gone for almost 40 years, and many who remembered it were either advanced in age or gone. Trades flourished, a second store had been built, and the neighborhood around Bethlehem continued to grow. The Moravians who were living in Bethlehem no longer felt the same purpose as those whose labor supported the church's missionary efforts years before. In fact, some felt akin to their neighbors of different faiths and national backgrounds. On May 18, 1806, a crowd of nearly 6,000 people gathered in Bethlehem to the sound of trumpets, trombones, and other wind instruments played by the community's musicians from the belfry of the newly built Moravian church. Processions were made from the old chapel into the new church with various choirs, church officials, and strangers, where they were greeted by the boom of the newly commissioned organ. The construction of Central Moravian Church was a watershed moment in Bethlehem's history with outsiders and would be one of the biggest indicators that change had come to Bethlehem and would remain constant throughout the 19th century. Unlike previous buildings in Bethlehem, the new church was designed and constructed primarily by outsiders who brought their own tastes, backgrounds, and architectural sensibilities with them. John Cooney of Reading, Pennsylvania, was the master builder, and several firms from Philadelphia and Easton did the woodwork and plastering. Bethlehem's architecture had always been an amalgamation of Baroque shapes and continental forms adapted to local materials. The new church, however, was built in the federal style, popular throughout the new republic. During the remainder of the 19th century, the church's exterior and interior changed to suit the dominant tastes in American architecture. This turning point for Bethlehem suggests that the community was beginning to accept more ideas from the outside world. These ideas manifested in the form of popular architectural styles and the gradual removal of the physical and invisible barriers around Bethlehem. In a way, outsiders constituted their own unofficial Moravian society and choir. They were permitted access to the different spatial levels of Bethlehem, from the very public to the very private. The church made sure each of these spaces were controlled and that their narrative was enforced, but visitors were welcomed into the fold because they brought with them economic opportunities. The Moravians provided outside spaces for non-Moravians, like the Stranger Store and the community's two inns. The Moravians diversified their retail inventory to include things like silk umbrellas, Hanover lace, pocket-looking glasses, German Reformed and Lutheran hymn books, hat buckles, needles from Whitechapel in London, Japan boxes, and brass compasses. This Strangers Choir would change Bethlehem from a spatially and culturally closed community to one whose open borders actually created a more homogeneous landscape of people and faith in this part of Pennsylvania. As the Moravians' missionary work dwindled among the Native Americans, they began to administer to their neighbors' material needs, since their conversion to Christianity was not necessary. It seems inevitable that refocusing the church's efforts on commerce would increase their concern for the welfare of outsiders who contributed to their new economy. The church felt this would appease their neighbors in allowing them to continue their own way of life unaltered. The church essentially took care of this Strangers Choir, like they did their own members. Their willingness to open up the boundaries essentially forced them into developing a new form of communalism based on church-controlled property and public-facing institutions, while solely losing control over the decisions individual Moravians made about their own lives. Visitation to Bethlehem is still intrinsically reliant on the cultural exchange between the material culture of the Moravians and the ideas and values that strangers bring with them. Visitors look to consume Moravian culture because it still holds intrigue and still can be commodified. The neatness, the order, and the prosperity that outsiders ascribed to Bethlehem in the 18th century now forms the cultural heritage and material life that the city prospers off to today. Understanding the complexities of Moravian material culture is fundamental to understanding the religious landscape that was widespread in America in the 18th and 19th centuries. Studying the material culture of groups like the Moravians helps us to make sense of the ever-changing nature of many intentional communities during this period of revivals and awakenings. Moravian communalism was not static, nor did it disappear when the general economy ended. For most groups, their material lives were directly affected by the world around them, despite their claims to be separated from it. Tourism, for one purpose or another, has been part of Bethlehem's history since the very beginning, And the city's new status as World Heritage Site is yet another chapter in the long narrative of Bethlehem and Moravian towns in general as great attractions for curious strangers and the world. Thank you.